Well, welcome and welcome to Birkbeck Arts Week as well. You may see, if you've just come in for this event, that this is a week-long festival of we've got different arts events of different kinds. So do pick up a programme for that at the front. We have this every year, so if you like arts festivals, think about coming to visit us and seeing what else is on. They're all free, public events, welcome. And everyone is welcome. So my name is Isabel Davis. I'm in the English department of the Centre for Medical Humanities at Birkbeck. And it's a real pleasure to be asked to chair this event on pharmacosexuality, sex and hormones. And we've got three speakers. And I think I'm going to introduce you all now. Does that sound right? And then we're going to have short papers and then we'll have a wide discussion. So we will ask each other questions, but we also invite questions from you or comments about the topic today. Okay, so first of all we're going to hear from Ericka Johnson, who is a professor at Linköping University in Sweden, and she has just finished a project on pharmaceuticals, medicine, creating identities, about the way that medicines create the concept of a healthy subject, a healthy individual. And she's moved on to a new project about the prostrate as a discursive mode of the Banks. Okay. And then we will hear from Tania Glyde, who is an integrative therapist in private practice and an author. And she specializes in seeing clients around sexology and gender, sexual and relationship diversity. Then we will hear from Alex Dymock, who is a lecturer in criminology and law at the Holloway University, Castle University of London. And she's working on a book project, or the book is nearly out, is that right?
No.
Working on a book project, Crime and Perversion, Abject Intimacies and the Erotics of Law, and has written widely on consent, harm and sex. And she has a current project on pharmacosexuality, the past, present and future of sex on drugs. Okay.
Right, Linköping University in Sweden, which is a very specific context. So I'm going to talk a little bit theoretically first about the concept of pharmaceuticalization as a term that we use to describe processes whereby we sociologists who look at it think that pharmaceuticals are becoming essential elements of part of our daily lives in a way that means that we need to use them or work through them or pay heed to them or ingest them or do something with them in order to do what we normally would have done without them before. And it's kind of this term that's bandied around, but it talks about the way pharmaceuticals as products are really coming into our bodies and our lives. However, I'm going to talk a little bit about the way that that's actually a very broad term and often applied in sweeping international contexts, but maybe could be nuanced a bit by looking at specific cultures. So I'm going to look at one specific culture. I'm going to look here, I talk here about what happened when Viagra came to Sweden. And I and some colleagues decided to examine this by, we're sociologists, so we like discourse. We looked at three different discourses. We looked at the legal discourse, the medical discourse, and the commercial discourse, and tried to ask what sort of images of masculinity were presented, but also of Viagra were presented by different actors involved in these discourses as Viagra came into Sweden. Eva Sjögren and Cecilia Olsberg were working with me on this. Know who they are, their work. So here's my slide on pharmaceuticalization. I guess I already told you all about it, and maybe I won't spend too much time on it. These are different, the dots there, the list, are different ways that people look at what pharmaceuticalization is happening in society, but just to give you a quick example, when the HPV vaccine came to Sweden, initially, it was not initially part of the free vaccine program, so the commercial interests were allowed to do some advertising for it. And what we ended up seeing in that advertising, so visual and textual discourses here, was that HPV vaccines were positioned in such a way as to be a mandatory element for mothers and daughters to be able to do the mother-daughter healthy relationship. I'm not saying that mothers and daughters had to use the vaccine to do that, but in the commercial images and commercial discourses that entered into Sweden with the HPV vaccine, there was this idea that if you were going to be a good mother or have a good relationship with your daughter, the HPV vaccine was part of that relationship. So that's sort of what we mean about pharmaceuticalization in discourses. When Viagra came, there was this whole idea that maybe Viagra and masculinity, doing good masculinity, would also be related there. The pharmaceuticalization would, like in many other contexts, say that we have to do Viagra. Men have to do Viagra. Bodies with penises should do Viagra to do proper masculinity, which would be proper penetrative sex. And to some extent that may be true, but here are 3 images and a list of masculine ideals, representations that were associated with Viagra in Sweden. The list was a list of things that people, in general, people, according to Pfizer, thought was appropriately masculine in Sweden. And it's my own translation, so I apologize if it's bad. You'll notice number 2 was to have good potency, presumed sexually. It was a poll that was funded by Pfizer, so I'm surprised by that. But also, if you look at the other images, in my eyes, they are particularly Swedish, or at least Nordic images of people doing masculinity, especially the one up in the far left, which is a man. To me, when I see this, I think immediately a man, maybe in his 30s, jumping off of the edge of a dock into the archipelago outside of Stockholm from his summer house, which means that he's upper middle class and has access to nature. And there's probably a case of beer and a bunch of other friends sitting there just behind him. And there's actually a beer commercial from the 1990s that has exactly this scene, which has appropriately the name Pripps Blue, which helped Viagra sell quite a bit in Sweden, I think. But anyways, so they really used a lot of existing images of what masculinity could be in Sweden when they started marketing the drug in the commercial discourse. They also were clearly advertising to men of means because it was not subsidized initially in Sweden. So here is a quote from their information page. Pfizer was not allowed to market directly to individuals in Sweden because we have a law against that, but they were able to put up an information page about erectile problems. And here you can see they quote, or they say, a healthy man will have an erection approximately every 70th to 100th minute when he is sleeping, regardless of whether he's thinking about sex or tax deductions. and so apparently the Viagra market is thinking about tax deductions or dreaming about them in Sweden. But then we also looked at the legal discourses, and this is where it got to be very, very interesting for us as sociologists, because as much as we might be like to think about discourses and subjectivities, I think all of us sometimes believe that there are social structures in the background having an impact, and here you could really see that happening in the process of pharmaceuticalization coming to Sweden with Viagra. So in 1998, Viagra becomes available. It becomes available almost immediately in Sweden, but it becomes available in a context which had, up until that point, automatically subsidized all prescription medication for all people in Sweden, because we have a fantastic healthcare system in Sweden, in my opinion. So we subsidize things, but people were very worried about what would happen with Viagra and the subsidy system. So they changed, maybe not only because of Viagra, but at that time, they changed the law and said, we will subsidize drugs, and new ones we'll consider on a case-by-case basis, which was very odd. But then when they considered Viagra, they decided that no, we're not going to subsidize Viagra. And of course, Pfizer said, no, this is wrong, you've made the wrong decision, and they started a legal battle. And that legal battle lasted for 10 years and went through the entire court system all the way up to the Supreme Administrative Court. And so my colleagues and I, because we really have no life, sat down and read all those legal documents and tried to analyze what image is of a Viagra-eating man are appearing in these documents, and who's presenting these images, and how does that, what is that doing to the discourse around Viagra and around masculinity? And the interesting thing that we saw was that almost immediately, Viagra stopped being a drug for better sex, or sex in general, and started being a drug to help men who have severe erectile dysfunction because of severe medical conditions, i.e. are truly sick according to the law, to be able to have an erection. And the reason that happened was because the only way it could ever potentially get subsidized would be if it could be deemed a legitimate use of taxpayer money to help cure somebody with a very severe medical problem. Erectile dysfunction, there's lots of interesting work on what that term means and how it came about, and I've written some of it, so go and Google it and find it, but I won't go into it here. However, erectile dysfunction is something that you can diagnose on a scale. People can have mild erectile dysfunction, or they can have very severe erectile dysfunction. And the Swedish state, through the course of these legal systems, the Swedish governing body about pharmaceuticals decided that it would actually be a legitimate use of Swedish taxpayer money to provide medicine for erectile dysfunction in cases of severe erectile dysfunction, which are often associated with MS, diabetes, heart disease, or other types of diseases that have that as a side effect of the cures. And that population in Sweden must be provided with medicine to provide erections, according to the Swedish state. However, in all these legal documents, it also became very clear that the bureaucratic body making these decisions was very afraid of bracket creep, which would mean that they were afraid that that definition of men with severe erectile dysfunction would slowly creep over towards the mild erectile dysfunction. And they would say things like, we, as this quote says, we are very convinced that men with mild erectile dysfunction who are not legitimate to receive, it's not legitimate for them to receive taxpayer money for this problem, those people will try to convince their doctors that their erectile dysfunction is severe so that the doctor will give them the prescription for free. And we don't think the doctors can resist that. And in these legal documents, of course, there are medical experts who say, well, it is actually our job to be able to diagnose patients. That's what we're trained for. We can do this. This is the case for lots of other situations as well. But the governing body was like, nope, we don't think that you will be able to push back all of these beguiling patients who are trying to, or conniving patients who are trying to beguile you into saying that they have a severe erectile dysfunction. However, and this is where when we did the study, this was where I thought, oh, thank goodness this is in the text. They did say there are 2 other drugs currently available in Sweden and subsidized for erectile dysfunction. One of them is delivered by a dissolvable stick that you can insert in your urethra and will produce an erection and then dissolve away. And the other one is a injection that you can administer yourself just before you want to have the erection with a needle, and men can learn how to do that themselves. And this was how their logic worked, the governing body making these decisions was pretty convinced that men who have truly severe erectile dysfunction and need a subsidized medicine may consider doing this, one of those 2 forms. But men who have mild erectile dysfunction are probably not interested in the way of receiving those drugs. And so they can just buy their Viagra themselves. And so the state was able to legitimately argue that we are providing medicine for men with severe erectile dysfunction, and that medicine in and of itself will do the diagnostic work that we don't trust our doctors to do. I assume that this silence is just like, oh, wow. Okay, so that is the end of my talk. But I just wanted to bring it back to the concept of pharmaceuticalization. Because I think a lot of times when I read international literature written about Viagra, even from medical sociologists, it is always talked about as a sex-enhancing drug, or an erection-enhancing drug in any case. And it is to some extent in Sweden too, but it was also a drug that I think really forced people to consider how we and who we assign, which professional groups we assign processes of diagnostic work to. But it also became, because of the structures governing the subsidization of pharmaceuticals by prescription for diseases, it became something different. It became much more of a medicine to treat a disease rather than a medicine to enhance an erection, or a drug to enhance erection. But I'll leave it there.
I'm here to talk about menopause. I'm just going to issue a quick disclaimer. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a researcher, although I may be a researcher at some point down the road. I'm aware there are many issues that hang off the idea of menopause and what I'm going to say, and so I'm sure they'll come up in the discussion. So I'm going to say what is menopause, who gets it, and what is their experience in the healthcare system. And then I'm just going to mention about 5 narratives, if you like, that come off that and may be useful in the discussion. So menopause, who knows what it is? Oh, okay, right. Menopause happens to people who are assigned female at birth. So that could be cisgender women, so women who are assigned female at birth and live as women. It could be trans men, it could be non-binary people. And it's important to just say it's not just women, because the public narrative of menopause is extremely normative. It's a woman married to a man who's had children, who's moving into middle age or moving through it. So it's just important to say that there's a whole piece not about this, and I'll be saying a bit more about that later. And what happens is you reach midlife, and that's a really wide thing, and gradually your body stops producing estrogen, or it slows down, and your periods stop, which means you're unable to have children. And obviously you might think that might be a huge relief to some people, and it is, as we'll see. And that would be great, and for some people, that's all that happens. So you go through life, periods stop. Oh, end of story. And that's great for those people. For a large number of people, there are some symptoms, which I will describe. And for a group of people, small but still significant, it's absolutely horrendous. People lose relationships, they lose jobs, and in a really terrible state. And it also becomes a mental health issue. Doctors are very attached to the idea that it's age 50, and it should happen around 50. You don't have a period for 12 months, and then you're officially in menopause. In fact, of course, there's something called perimenopause, which can start at least 10 years before. So someone may notice symptoms in their early 40s, even their late 30s, and not know what on earth they are. And there's no guarantee that you will go to your doctor going, I'm having some memory loss, I'm having strange mood swings, and my periods have become irregular. There's no guarantee you'll be told anything. Here's a list of symptoms. Like I said, some people have none, some have some, and some have life-changing experiences. Hot flushes, sweating, insomnia, depression, anxiety, rage, memory loss, hair loss, unusual hair growth, weight gain, general and localized pain, eczema, osteoporosis or brittle bones, stress incontinence, and, relevant to tonight, lowered or no libido and vaginal atrophy. Vaginal atrophy doesn't sound good. It's a horrible phrase, and it refers to the thinning or the drying of the vaginal and surrounding walls, so also the urethra, hence some stress incontinence. It's not really a great list. It's not good to hear about that, and not good to experience. And as I say, most people won't have all of them, but some people will certainly have a good number of those symptoms. Now, obviously, with even a few of those symptoms, you might not even want sex, but you might want the chance to have it. And if you were having sex and your libido's gone and your vagina is not functioning the way it was and you are using your vagina for sex, you might want to go and get some pharmaceutical and medical help. It's really important to say that there are nice doctors, good doctors, doctors who take care and time to listen out for what's going on and take you through what you could do or not do. Unfortunately, I have to say very strongly that the experience is incredibly variable of women from, say, their late 30s into their 40s and 50s and 60s, and it can be a very, very bad experience and very disempowering. Starting from the worst end, someone might turn up and simply be, run along, it's natural. It'll go away in a few years, bye. So a little bit further up the scale is someone may be given antidepressants. You're depressed, no wonder this is depressing for you, bye. A doctor who's thought a bit more and read the studies will have found out that a low dose of citalopram, SSRI, can help with hot flushes. So someone may be given that, it's kind of off-label, but you know, it can work, it seems to have a good outcome. And then we get to HRT, which you've probably heard of, hormone replacement therapy, which is generally a mixture of estrogen, progesterone. There are other kinds, and there's bioidenticals. We can maybe talk about those. And so that could help someone, but there are risks. There are health risks with hormones. There's a breast cancer risk. Anyone who knows about this will know there was a big study in the noughties, I think it was, or the late 90s, which had some quite frightening statistics about cancer, and prescriptions dropped really quickly, and lots of people just stopped taking it or stopped taking it cold turkey. Doctors were asked for it less and gave it out less. Then more studies said, well, actually, hold on. I think there was another study in 2016 which said there's about a 34 in 1,000 likelihood of getting breast cancer. And clearly, it's not insignificant, but it's weighing up quality of life, and some of these symptoms are horrendous, and the effect on sex. Someone's sex life can be horrendous. There are pills and there are patches, and patches are a bit safer because it bypasses the liver. There are also, and we can talk about this, herbal alternatives, not very well studied, and nothing I've heard of for sex and libido, although if someone knows, then we can talk about that. So that's basically it. It is somewhat disempowering to sit at the doctor and explain these sometimes quite humiliating symptoms. And we can't forget that we live in an ageist, sexist society, and sometimes many people feel they just ought to shut up because it's a bit embarrassing. And another thing just to say is that it can be given and it can be taken away, hormone replacement therapy. You could take it for maybe 5 years or 10, and if your surgery has a policy, your doctor's surgery has a policy, you might be just taken off it. 5 years, you off. And some women have reported kind of imploding. You know, quite sad descriptions of people going from feeling pretty much okay to sort of collapse within really quite a short time. Someone was liking it. Anyone heard of the movie She from the 60s? Okay. There's a scene where I can't remember the plot, but the beautiful woman takes whatever the thing is, the medicine or the something or other, and then becomes a very old woman and then a skeleton and then melts on the floor. And it's quite a horrible scene. I remember it as a child. So that's menopause, basically. So we are focusing on sex, but we can't really focus on sex without the things that's around it. I need to say a few things. I'm reaching my 5 points now. This is a very white Western perspective. Most of the studies of menopause are, I think, American, they're white, they're Western, and actually there are other meanings around the world, and there are many studies, well, not enough, but there are an increasing number, let's say. In some cultures, someone may report chills rather than hot flushes, because we have this big comedy thing about flushes and opening windows in this country. In some cultures, and also here, it could be very welcome to be menopausal. If you've had to trade having babies and using your vagina for sex in order to be married to a man and be socially acceptable, you actually might be really happy when that duty was over. So you might be celebrating menopause. And here's the main point about sex and drugs. Why is there no effective menopause sex drug for women? Men have had, as we've been hearing, men have had Viagra for 20 years. It's a drug with quite a mechanical operation. There was a drug called flibanserin, or Addy, in the US, which was for premenopausal women anyway, and it's a sort of sub-Viagra. Maybe one of you knows more about it, but it's clearly a bit rubbish and doesn't seem to really work very well. So, of course, we have testosterone, the male hormone, and it's actually really hard to get testosterone on the NHS if you're identified as a woman in this country, because there isn't a specific medication, and people end up going to clinics and maybe even going private, which is obviously a whole financial thing there. In America, there was a drug called Libigel, which was tested, which was tried for about 5 years. This is in the last decade or so. And there was a specific profile. I think the women involved had to have cardiovascular issues or something else. Whatever it was, the FDA didn't approve it. because it didn't really have very strong results. What they did notice was a very strong placebo effect. So if someone knows more about that, I was doing a bit of reading about it, and placebo seems to be a big thing around menopause, which is why people will talk about herbs and pills, and perhaps more people talk about herbs and things than you might expect, or people you wouldn't expect to talk about that, and placebo seems to be strong, so we could talk about that. So, but let's come back to testosterone, or T as it's called, and I think there's a coyness in calling it T, because of course it's seen as the toxic masculinity hormone as well. And that's actually quite incorrect. If you've read Cordelia Fine's excellent book, Testosterone Rex, that will explain why it's not that simple. But I can't help wondering why it is so hard for women to get T on the NHS, and I can't help thinking about the idea that nobody really wants a bunch of middle-aged women and older women strutting about demanding sex and demanding rights. So it's just worth thinking about that. There's another thing here, is why should the vagina be used for sex? You know, penis and vagina sex is seen as the sex, and all other forms of sex are kind of subsidiary, and this is total rubbish. As I'm sure you know, but people still seem to need to have this explained, which I find really concerning. You know, there are so many ways to get pleasure from the body which don't even have anything to do with the genitals. And I wonder, actually, if your vagina has stopped functioning in the way that it's supposed to, i.e. receiving a penis, you know, now is the time perhaps to go and explore other forms of sex. So that's just another thought, but sex ed is terrible, as we all know. Just returning to the queer menopause, this needs to happen. People may be losing out on medical calls for scans and all sorts of stuff because they transition, for example, and it may say male on their records, and actually they need to be called in for something which they're now not being called in for. It's, as I said, it's just a very, very heteronormative portrayal in the media. I also can't help noting, you know, menopause is a hormonal transition, and some might say that a woman who's lost her reproductive capacity and her capacity to receive a penis in vagina has therefore lost her gender or found a new one. So that's something I've been reflecting on, the sort of queerness of that, or whatever that might mean. And my last point is, why medicalise this at all? Some people get quite militant and say, well, you know, don't take HRT, it's toxic and it's natural, just receive the vibes and just sit there with it. And I don't want to say that's wrong at all, but unfortunately, and I have to bring capitalism and neoliberalism in just at the end, we're in a society where we're increasingly expected to work until we drop. Benefits are being eroded year on year. The retirement age is being pushed back and back and back. The NHS is wobbling badly. And in a sense, just coming back to the drugs, you know, someone might want some drugs that kept them upstanding, aggressively working and with more energy, simply to survive that society. So I'm not going to say which is right and wrong, but I just wanted to throw that point in. Anyway, that's me. Thank you.
So I'm going to talk briefly about a project we've just literally started working on about 17 days ago. So rather than being at the end of the project, we're right at the beginning. But in some ways, I always think that's the best time to talk about a project, because I think it's great to get sort of feedback on it at a really early stage. But it does mean that what I'm saying is quite sketchy and preliminary. This is a project I'm working on with a colleague at Griffith University in Australia called Liam Moyle, who's the drugs expert in this project, and Ben Meacham, who I'm afraid is sitting there, who is a sort of historian of sexuality. And the project really is concerned, or rather was born, out of two theoretical ideas that we've been sort of thinking about for the last couple of years, actually. So the first question I wanted to sort of pose is, what is the pharmacosexual? Why on earth have we called our project this? Because we started off kind of being interested in chemsex practices and chemsex kind of discourses and the public health crisis that surrounded it. But instead, what we wanted to do was think more broadly about the relationship between sex and drugs, and we started digging a little bit around the literature on this. So one sort of piece of work we found was Leonor Tieffer's work on what she calls the pharmacosexual. So Tieffer in particular, I'm sure some of you are familiar with her work, she's been particularly critical of the diagnosis of female sexual dysfunction, and specifically therapeutic interventions like Viagra. And she's quite critical of the way she thinks that drugs like Viagra, and in fact particularly the female Viagra that Tania was just describing, what she takes to be the sort of commercialised hijacking of sexuality. So that kind of stimulated our interest, because she sort of said, well, actually, you know, there's very little written about this. And we thought, oh, that's interesting. Why is there so little written about this idea of the pharmasexual? On the other hand, Preciado's study, I think heavily influential on lots and lots of scholars interested in sexuality, in biopolitics, and so on. That study of biopolitics in what Preciado calls the pharmacopornographic capitalist era is something that's certainly of interest to us. So for those of you not familiar with Preciado's work, he's talking as part of this project, actually I think it's the 5th of June at the Wellcome Trust, I think so. So in his book Testo Junkie, he uses this term to describe the kind of collaboration of two particular processes. On the one hand, the biomolecular, what's the pharmaco, and the semiotic technical, the pornographic. And essentially, what Preciado does is track how these two sorts of processes come together and govern sexual subjectivity. So specifically, he looks at the emergence of the pill and the emergence of Playboy as two kind of paradigmatic offspring. So what particularly interested us about Preciado's work was the way he talked about a kind of self-referential loop. The pharmacopornographic is kind of self-referential, in that it kind of has invented the late modern sexual subject and then reproduces that subject kind of endlessly. So the book is essentially what he calls a kind of cultural archive. He sort of uses his body as a cultural archive to talk a bit about, in particular, the experience of taking testosterone. Now, what particularly interests us about Preciado's work is that, unlike Tifa, he doesn't say, well, you know, this is all terrible that this has happened. What he's interested in is thinking about the ways we might kind of mutate the pharmacopornographic as well, and that, in particular, was interesting to us. So from there, we've tried to sort of address two main questions in the project. These are the sort of two things we're going to look at. And one of the things we're really interested in is the interaction between, on the one hand, essentially sort of therapeutic interventions around sexuality, and particularly psychoactive substances as forms of kind of therapy. And on the other hand, the recreational use of psychoactive substances for sort of sexual modification, experimentation, and enhancement. So one question is around the interaction between those two forms of modification. We also want to think a little bit about whether there's ever been a form of sexuality that has not been subject to synthetic enhancements. Because I think that's something that seems to come up a great deal, particularly in Tifa's work, the idea that this has suddenly sort of happened around the 1960s onwards, and we want to explore going back a little bit further than that. The second question we want to think about is the idea of sexuality as kind of prostheticized, and specifically what this tells us about sexual health, the idea of sexual health. If there are ideals around sexuality being themselves a product of pharmacology, does that mean we actually have to think about what we mean by sexual health all over again? Do we need to rethink ideas of sexual health? Do we need to think not just about the dangers, which is very much what sort of frames the chemsex discourse, but the productive possibilities of sex on drugs for kinship, for new forms of embodiment and for pleasures. So our project is very much situated in the West. I think it's important to say that, but what I thought I'd do briefly is touch on a little bit of what we've sort of been looking at so far. So the project is both archival and empirical. So on the one hand, we're trying to kind of build a cultural archive, if you like, of the pharmacosexual. We're trying to sort of trace its history. We're looking at a wide range of drugs. And at the moment, in particular, we're looking at LSD. So one of the things we found really, really interesting, pretty much on the first day of the project, actually, it's kind of a very lucky find, was the way that LSD was prescribed for various sexual problems. So specifically, quite interestingly, for frigidity, and specifically that it was used for people identifying as women. And one of the early texts that we sort of we've been looking at is this particular book by Constance Newland, which I find really interesting because I think it does that interesting thing of kind of melding the therapeutic and the recreational. So it's essentially a kind of it's again a kind of autoethnographic study of a journey into LSD experiences, which she kind of says this cured my frigidity by taking LSD therapy. Now, what's quite interesting to me about it is that it does fit this interaction between the therapeutic and the recreational. So it's prefaced by a psychiatrist, by this guy, Harold Greenwald, who was one of the kind of LSD therapists in the kind of 50s and 60s. But on the other hand, what we learn really swiftly in the book is that Constance Newland essentially just wanted to get her hands on some LSD. She was really curious about its effects. And she found this advert for a study that was taking place on LSD therapy. She went to the doctor, and he said, well, you know, you have to sort of have a mental health problem to be given the LSD. And she said, oh yes, I'm frigid. And was given a sort of about a year's worth of LSD therapy, and she sort of traces this through the book. So it is this very curious sort of mixture of discourses we see in sort of books like this. Newland herself, I think, is what we might now term a psychonaut. She's really experimenting with drugs to extend and modify her sexual experiences, but she's kind of using the clinical to get hold of those drugs. So for me, this is a really sort of fascinating example of what I would call the pharmacosexual. Very briefly then, the empirical part of the project, one of the things we're doing is a kind of digital trace study. So there's interesting sort of ethical questions about this, which I can touch on in the discussion. But one of the things we're doing is essentially looking through the sort of year that the project will run. We're looking in forums such as Reddit, such as Ericka, which is the kind of major drugs forum, at the kinds of behaviours, experiences, discourses of psychonauts. So one of the things we found really interesting is that before we even began the project, we started doing a bit of preliminary searching, and one of the things we found really interesting is that it's certainly not just chemsex drugs that people use for sexual enhancement, experimentation, and so on. What is quite interesting, I was thinking about this as Tania was talking, is that there doesn't seem to be a great deal of discourse around the idea of the therapeutic on these forums. It is all experimentation, enhancement. But one of the things that we did find interesting quite early on is that there's this sort of search within these forums for the perfect sex drug, for the perfect synthetic aphrodisiac. So some of the discussions, and this is where hormones comes in, some people say, well, how can we create an analogue for what is essentially oxytocin, which is often called the kind of love hormone? How can we kind of, is there such a thing as one? How can it be created? What might that particular analogue psychoactive substance look like? So the very idea that there's a kind of market for a sort of perfect drug that will project the user into sort of flights of sexual ecstasy, I think tells us something quite important about changing ideals around what sexuality is and to what extent psychoactive substances might reshape boundaries of kinship and embodiment and sexual pleasure. And that's it from me.